I also wanted to point out to you, as often happens, when the doctors had you on the couch for some odd minutes, he usually, particularly if you've got white hair like I do, gotten to that age, he cautions you, now be a little careful, you might be dizzy when you get up. So you will have been on the couch a good deal longer than your usual doctor's appointment, and of course under much more, what should I say, extensive invasion. Dr. Arani really goes way down into the unconscious, and one can't be absolutely too sure of just what all might be touched in the process. But very, very seriously, when you leave and you go home, if you feel a bit of dizziness or any disorientation, for heaven's sake, if you're on the San Diego freeway, pull over to the side and wait till the dizziness passes. So, you all forewarned? I saw a few snickers and smiles. It must be the way I deliver it, because it sounded advice, you see. The three little plastic things over on that table there are exhibits. I'll tell you just a moment about them. The center one is the one that really touches me deeply. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the family name Agostini, Louis and Vivian Agostini. I won't go into all of the background, but I think you're also aware of the fact that Vivian, well into her 90s, very recently passed on. And I was very touched because shortly after, I had a nice packet, a nice personal letter from Louis, and included in that were some copies of sketches that Vivian had made. And quite frankly, although I knew some of Vivian's background as an artist, I was just so delighted to see the wonderful sense of humor, caprice, that Vivian embodies in her works. So I just said, I'm going to take those around on the God Speaks seminars and give people the opportunity to see some of this. Also, you remember that shortly after the 62 East-West gathering, she made that magnificent bronze medallion of Baba, which of course Baba was the first one to receive, which he loved. And if you haven't seen it, or if you have seen it, go take a look at that medallion. It's beautiful. There are two other things. You know, the Archives project under Mayor Wu is going ahead full tilt, and many people have received letters saying if you've got anything, correspondence relating to Baba or with the Mongolia, be sure we get it, or at least a photocopy of it. And so after doing a certain amount of fuming and sputtering, which I do on occasion, you know, I've always got my provisos and cross fingers and whatnot, and so I've been going through my archives and getting out things that I felt pertained, especially to the literary things that Father has had me involved in practically all of my life now. And in doing that, I came across several things that I frankly had never read before. And so two or three of those were so interesting to me and represented a refreshing viewpoint from Mani, from Baba. So I made photocopies of those and included them. I think you'll enjoy seeing them. Let me see, what was it? Oh, yes. One of the first things I'm going to launch into this morning is what happens to you and me when we pick up God Speaks. And there is a very, very, to me, apt and important parallel that goes on, especially in science nowadays. And to me, the best chronicler of some of these goings-on is an American writer who's up in San Francisco by the name of Timothy Ferris. And his most recent book, that really knocked me out, was called The Whole Shebang. And first of all, anybody who's got the courage to call a very, very fine book The Whole Shebang automatically has my admiration. But as I poured into it, I found my admiration just increasing by leaps and bounds, because he has such a delightful personal style. And you just write in there in the stars and the universe is with him, looking at things that are fascinating, and put in very personal and delightful terminology. So there are two or three things that I thought were very apropos of what we're discussing, and I made photocopies of those. I'd like you to see them in your written if you'd like to follow them up.
Now,
Yes, ma'am.
do you know Timothy?
I've had email exchanges with him.
He's been a dear friend of mine for about 20 years.
Well, bless your heart. I think you know one of the most wonderful human beings I've contacted in a long time. He's terrific.
He is terrific, and I met him because he married one of my very best friends. And they used to live in Los Angeles, and then he moved up to San Francisco. But the reason I'm sharing this story is that in his third book, forget the name of it, I was invited up to San Francisco for the book signing. And he, like I said, had been a dear friend for so many years, and I had read his books, and then his third book came out, and I read it, and he also had his first PBS series, The Creation of the Universe, also taken by the scientific parallel, of course, with God Speaks, so that when I went up to his book signing, I said, Timothy, I said, enough time has gone by where we're both friends and we shared in each other's lives, and I said, I just have to give you the parallel to your book that really explains the explanation of the universe, and I gave him a copy of God Speaks.
Oh my golly, I duplicated your gift. We're going to have to ask for that back.
Since I don't know, maybe...
Anyway, he sent me a nice email after he got it appreciatively that said, this isn't exactly my cup of tea because it can't be proved. So, I sort of refrained from telling him, well, actually it can, but it usually takes a good bit of a lifetime to prove it. So, at any rate, that's the third folder, and I warmly recommend Marvelous Writer. Well, is it, what should I say, is it acceptable to everybody that we start at the beginning? Okay. I find very few people who argue with that, And of course, obviously, the beginning, it's not even the beginning of creation, it's when you pick up God Speaks. That's the beginning I want to start at today. My horrible habit of picking out an unsuspecting person in the audience who look like they're about to nod off and ask them, and then they've got to reply quickly. That puts everybody on the alert, and we go on fine from there. So I'm going to ask Charlie Morton, what happened to you, Charlie, when he wasn't sleeping, by the way?
No, not always.
As always, he's looking alert and beady-eyed about it.
Well,
Charlie, what happened to you when you picked it up?
I found it was extremely refreshing because I hadn't gone over it in so many years that it was a wonderful opportunity for me to go back into it again and renew something that was a wonderful feeling and visualization of what Bob was talking about at the time. And also, I was reading aloud the whole time to Anna, and for some reason, when you're reading aloud, it even creates more of an environment so that you're really captured in it. And
did Anna stay awake?
Anna was giving me pop quizzes all through it, and so therefore pop quizzes. And so she's a teacher, so she is all of a sudden she said, "Okay, now I'm going to quiz you on all of this," and she would go back over it, and she was retaining much more than I was retaining of it, and so I was quite impressed with her ability to recite things back. But the thing that I pointed out to her, what fascinated me this time through was the fact that the parallel in the different religions of all the terminology, it just shows that all this knowledge has been there all along, but my gosh, we sure have done a great job of covering it up.
Yeah. Covering it up. And never having uncovered it.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Covered for generations now. So, but how did you feel about the general content, the styling of it? Was it fairly digestible, or did you have a few bad moments where you were almost tempted to say, well, I don't know why Bob did this or that? Have any of those? We're not at a success story.
Yeah. No.
We're here to trade punches realistically.
I found that it was delightful as long as I didn't get too bogged down in the terminology of each of the different realization states. If I tried, I'd had, because I'd always listened to all of the Sufi tapes on the Fana and Baka and everything else that was going on, it made it easy to sort of visualize and see it going along, but at the same time, there was so much terminology, I didn't want it to bog down a lot, and that was a big thing, is for me to be able to go through and not try to get hung up on reciting the name exactly correctly or something of this nature. Yeah.
I many times felt very depressed.
Well, that's just straight from the shoulder, isn't it? I know.
When I read through every day 12 pages. So it come right a couple days ago I finished.
So the depression was sort of metered out that way.
No, it was depressed, better depressed than later. Sometimes I recovered when I read next paragraph. But it sounded so to me so complex and very love, Then I tried to figure it out. There's nothing about love. Right here you said nothing.
Yes, that's the first thing I quote Baba's own words.
But it bothered me. Something bothered me very much. And then I realized it's because nothing about love.
Well, it's interesting that you raised that point. We'll go on with this quizzing because it's very important. But exactly a parallel sort of thing happened. The groups in France have been waiting for years for the translation of God's speech. Many of them have tried to learn English in the past, and for some reason or another, I don't know, maybe it's negative propaganda about Americans and English people, but they get stopped. They come to a barricade trying to learn English. So they've been waiting for years, and the first meeting in Paris that I went to after it had been published and came out, I looked around and it looked like everybody was sort of in a mold, like an old hen that's losing its feathers. So I thought, golly, they ought to be smiling and triumphant after all of these years. What's going on? So, when we started talking and exchanging points of view and so on, nobody was particularly anxious to put their finger on the trouble. I suppose they felt it'd be disloyal to Baba if they said anything in criticism. But finally somebody sort of edged up a little bit that something or another wasn't quite there, and I pricked up my ears and somebody else added 2 or 3 more words. And then finally it just came out in a flood from all the people. There's almost never a page where the word love is used in God's speech. And so they were really, really sad about the thing. But then they decided, and I thought it was an act of real bravery, the group decided that they would go meeting by meeting in the group, systematically through God's speech. They would take a chapter or a certain number of pages as homework and do that ahead of time, and do any underlining and make even notes of things that were especially unusual or startling, and also things that they just needed further clarification. But I would say after a couple of sessions, seeing how they reacted, probably they got into things that began to excite them, and they would pop up with creative observations, intuitive observations that got me excited and that got them excited. So all of a sudden, after 2 or 3 sessions, it's not all of a sudden, but quite rapidly, they really began to feel God's speech as something very live and very exciting and terribly important fundamentally. So I'm going to ask Lois here, because I've never heard Lois give us the lowdown on a subject like this. So Lois, what would you say about
Section 6? But yeah, I'm sorry.
You're on Section 6, are you?
Well, second time around. I mean, years ago I read the whole thing.
I see, second time
Yeah.
around.
So anything prior to Section 6. So what do you want
I just want to know how you reacted to it the second time around,
Well,
up to Section 6.
Like Charlie, we started to. I wanted to read it aloud with other people, and also I thought that would help me get it read, in time for this. And so we had a little study group of 2, and one time there were like 4.
That's a pretty small study.
Yeah, and then there were like 4 of us,
Can't get much smaller than that. Excuse me, Lois, the door was open, I had to walk through that.
But then it went up to 4, then it went to 0. Okay, so.
I
But
see.
anyway,
That was chapter 6.
we were reading. No, I got very ill for a month in bed.
I see.
But anyway, I found reading it aloud, listening to someone else reading it aloud, I just had this feeling of excitement about it. I was thrilled. Even if there was, stuff I didn't understand, which was probably most of it, but there was just a certain, I don't know how else to explain it. I never expected to feel excited about every word that I was hearing or reading in God Speaks, and that's just how it felt for me.
It did.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
that's marvelous.
Yeah.
I think that's really exciting, isn't it? Thank you, Lois. I'm glad we put you on the spot.
You're like, no, you're not back there.
You know, I just finished reading it this week.
First time, second time?
No, I think it's maybe the third or fourth.
Oh, you're an old timer then.
The first time, this time when I read it, I realized that it's unlike any book I've ever tried to read, because about halfway through, I realized that it's actually like music. It's like Ravel's Bolero. It repeats itself, but each time it comes around, there's more detail.
I'm going to prop a guy on dice on preludes and fugues with him. I like the fugue better than the bolero.
Okay.
But it was repetitive but stimulating, so.
like Beethoven. Or, yeah.
How can I help? What would you like to say about it?
Well, I would just add to what other people have said that I didn't mind the absence of love because Baba wrote it, who is the personification of love. So for me, even when I was reading along or listening to Peter and I read it aloud to each other, what I liked was that I felt that I was getting a really complete analysis, if you will, of the whole structure of creation and how I fit into it. And the underlining theme for me was, there is a structure to the universe. God always knows where you are, and you're always somewhere, going somewhere, from somewhere. And where you ultimately end up is back at me. So who wouldn't want to do that? And so I found the intellectuality of it fascinating. And I found, and Baba keeps, every time he takes a step forward, then he kind of echoes back, the first most, gross level of this, and then you take another step. And so he always reminds you of where you are. So you really don't need to get lost.
But the repetitiveness didn't bother you then, or at least on this reading.
No, it didn't. It really didn't. And to my amazement and surprise, the first time I tried to read God Speaks was when I first found out about Baba, because I was so afraid I'd drop my body before I read it. You don't worry, let's get with it.
Frankly, it's the first time I ever heard of that approach. I dropped the body.
I really
Still
knew.
relatively young,
Well, so I was so eager to get up to being able to run after Bob, and
you regard that as homework that you should do before.
yeah. Well, hey, I had school teacher parents who were manic with that, but I really appreciated the fact that Bob figured out a way to write something very sophisticated that gross plain people can actually understand. You don't have to be on the planes of consciousness to gain a great deal from this book. And that impressed me. I mean, when I tried to imagine trying to explain to an ant some of the things I know, I can't imagine how to do it. But Mayor Baba took this opportunity to leave us with this description, which builds naturally and logically upon itself. So that by the time you get into those higher planes of consciousness, when it's really hard to relate to personally, it's very, very believable. Oh, that's what I did.
Well, those are reassuring words. Your next door neighbor would like to add something to that, too.
Well, I want to refer to what she said about the musical part of it, and several people have. The thing I liked about the repetition was that it actually made me feel that sometimes I understood what was going on. Because I was
Was this
reading,
first time, or?
I started reading God Speaks about 10 years ago, and it's longer than that now, I guess.
Did the repetition bother you at that time?
I didn't get that far.
You didn't.
The
Oh, I
first
see.
time I
Put it aside.
tried to read God Speaks, I picked it up and I read the first chapter, and I thought, I can't fathom this at all. This is for people that want to intellectually understand who Baba is. And I don't need that. And I put the book aside. And I began rereading it in a study group this year. And I had a totally different experience of it.
Just spontaneous from the beginning? You mean something had shifted inside of you?
Yeah, I just decided, one morning I got up and I decided that I wanted to read it. And it was as if it were a totally different book. And it was like an experience. It wasn't like reading a book. It was like being in samadhi. There were days when I thought, I don't even know if I can handle picking up the book. And it's not really something I can explain intellectually. It's just that at times I would read it and I would start crying, and I would just read the words and I would cry. And other times I would read it and I would feel that in some way I was experiencing what Baba was talking about versus understanding. Now, not the whole book. There are parts of this book that I laugh as I read them because I go, I can't fathom one word that this, I don't have any idea what this paragraph means. And I'll sit with other people who will all say, what does that mean? I don't know. So it's not the whole book. It was interesting to me that I perceived it so differently.
Well, at the key point, you certainly make that very clear. You are familiar with all of the stories that come from so many directions. People, the first time they met Baba, just burst into tears, not in sadness, and sometimes uncontrollably, even for 1, 2, 3 days, before finally they dried up. So this business of bursting into tears is a fairly common experience. So I sort of suspect, that you had a pretty direct meeting there.
Well, I was
there's one more hand, and then I'm going to, and I can't neglect you. Anyway, but back there first.
Well, I've read God Speak several times, but not for years. And I picked it up this week. And on the first page, what came right off the page, I mean, this is the only book where there's not one word wasted.
It's tight instruction. What would you read?
Well, I'm just going to say I read the book twice. I just recently finished it the second a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. But the first time I read it, the first part that she was talking about, I really felt like it was a mantra, even though it's repetitive, and especially if you say it out loud, it made me think of the ocean of love, and like a little wave would come, and then another little wave would come, and you could sort of feel like it was going inside of you. Like that was really neat, and
that happens spontaneously.
It makes you think of how Baba says it's the ocean of love. And then the second time it was just so thrilling to read it. And the clarity of it and the way Baba chose the words and the sentences was just extraordinary. It was just a thrill, and I talked to a few other people in the last few weeks who said the same thing. The only part that was hard for me in the supplement was the part about all the Sufi terms. There's one little chapter there.
That was Connie, and he knew his material very deeply, of course.
Yeah.
So he was very technical.
That was pretty hard.
Well, let me tell you one thing. A number of you have certainly heard this story or even read it because it did get into it. And that was Baba's comment to me about the use of his words. It goes way back to the time when he had me involved in re-editing the discourses from the Deshmukh edition, which is 5 little books, and re-editing it into what became the 3 blue book editions that we use for Sutara. So I've been working on it for several months at the time, and I got to the India on another occasion. Baba said, well, Don, how's it going? Are you almost done now? And I said, yes, just about finished, Baba. I think we'll have it in the finished hands in Japan. We're going to do the edition over there because it's so good and cheap to do it there. And but I don't know what prompted me to say this. It's almost never that I just volunteer a comment like this to Baba. but it just sprang out. But I said, Bob, but however, I don't know how many people are ever going to use this. He started to look at me, yes, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, there's so many people who say words and intellect and so on. And so many of the people who love you so very, very deeply simply say, I don't even bother to read even Baba's own words. It's the heart and it's the love. That's my feeling, and my feeling for Baba that is the all-important thing. And Baba looked a little bit smiling, but sort of a jaundiced smile, and he said, well, John, I must tell you, when I give out words to my lovers for consumption generally, I always attach a spiritual charge, and we sort of went back and forth with Aries to try to find the exact correct word as he would often do. And he said it's sort of like attaching a spiritual atomic bomb to each word. And he said, in fact, an individual who is reading Baba's words, even if they do not understand one word, sense it, still they will absorb a certain portion of that spiritual energy that I have attached. And so you must tell people that this is what Baba has done, and that they should work with Baba's words, and the spiritual energy that they will absorb by doing so will be invaluable in their spiritual progress. That's Baba's exact words. So he was, first of all, shocked at the idea that people who loved him would, in some manner or another, underestimate the intent of his words and what it might possibly do for him. So I think this is a terribly important thing. I'll just give you one little tiny example. First time I ever told this story was in a group in London, and one of the fellows there, who incidentally was, especially at that time, very, very emotionally unstable. And, you know, we just burst out into tears for no apparent reason at any old time. And we were always trying to prop him up and cheer him up and ensure that he was feeling good. And he took this absolutely literally. And 2 or 3 times later, after groups had been meeting, he came up to me and said, Don, you know, I was so struck by your account of what Baba said that I just read God Speaks through from cover to cover twice in a row. He said, obviously, I don't have nothing, very bright guy. But he said, I certainly don't have the mental capacity to be able to pierce through to the meaning of Baba's words. And I did it rather rapidly, but he said, you know, I felt the truth of Baba's words, that it will do a great deal in your spiritual ongoing. But what I noticed was this breaking out spontaneously into tears hither and gone and so on. It was cut it by at least 2/3. And from that point on, a lot of things began to knit together. And this fellow's life, that the very best psychoanalysts, doctors and so on, and pep pills and whatnot, couldn't do over a period of years and years and years. So when I talk about Dr. Mariwani Rami, you know, this is really for real. But, so, first of all, I would say, do take Baba absolutely literally when he says, I've attached a spiritual charge. And this is not just God's speech. I think, you know, one of the things we've got to go into quite early today is the subject of how did Baba give out God's speech? And how dependable is it? And above all, what did we possibly do very inferiorly develop, at least myself, editors who then came along, what did we do that might have not got the works? I think you need to know the dependability of what's between the covers. So, but at any rate, the first thing above all is to know that Baba had put that spiritual charge there. It is true not just of God's speech, we'll go in and see how dependable it is. It is also totally true of part 2 of Listen Humanity. You all know that at the end of the first language group, which Baba let me come to in India many years ago, we had this little pile of paper sitting over there. And he passed them on over the background. He said, now here's a collection, sometimes short, sometimes a bit longer, of addresses that Baba had given out for various public meetings, mostly at different places in India. And he said, always before a public meeting, I did, it was usually Irish, but one of them on would copy down word by word what Baba wanted to say. Baba went over this in a meticulous fashion, correcting very, very carefully. So all of part 2 has gone over word by word by Baba in the same manner that God speaks. And the secretary's transcripts in part 1 are taken directly, passed through Baba and Irish, and then on to me to be utilized. All I did was put a little framework around those. So here is a second resource of impeccable material. You attend it. The discourses, Baba did not say I went over them word by word, but of course they were taken down carefully. I think Elizabeth Patterson, and those of you who knew Elizabeth, know how dependable Elizabeth Patterson was. Not that Baba ever had a close one who did things minutely, properly. That was Elizabeth Patterson. And then, of course, Baba handled them, and they were used in many, many, many different situations under Baba's general overseas, you see. So the discourses, although they were not given out in exactly the same fashion as God speaks and many of the parts that listen to humanity, still, they are very, very dependent. Shall we take just a moment to describe, Baba felt that the understanding of the care that we put into the assemblage of the words in God speaks until you get to the supplement was so important that he had Irish repeated twice to me on different occasions. You know, Baba rarely wasted time like that, so it meant it had to be a pretty high priority thing. He was pretty well aware, excuse me to mention names, that this is one of the most highly respected and beloved person in Baba lore, Charles Purdom, who's done the 2 wonderful books on Baba that we have. But Purdom had made mention, because he's a good, honest reporter, he had said, you know, we're really not too sure that we have Baba's words, something like that, you know. It was a rather surprising statement. An awful lot of people gave couple books, and Purdom went on to explain that, you know, they were passed through secretaries and editors and so on, and heaven knows how many things. Many times a secretary simply took notes and wrote them up at another time. The Purdom had a good point. He was trying to point out to people that have a care. After all, Baba was silent for much of his life. So don't feel necessarily that what we have written down is direct from Baba, and therefore it should be fallible. That's the point that he was trying to get over. But Baba knew about this, so he had Irish give me the mechanism. And what Irish explained with Baba nodded, he would have Irish come in early in the day, and he would give Irish principal key points. Then Irish would go back to his bedroom at night, and he would write up more fully and in a logical sequence the material that Baba had given him during the earlier part of the day. First thing, the next morning, when Irish would come to Baba's room, Irish would read out, word by word, what he had said. And as soon as there was any point of problematicalness in Baba's mind, Irish's comprehension or the utilization of a specific word, Baba would go clap and stop Irish, and they would clarify between them. Then, if it got to be a word that was very key and very difficult to find exactly the word that had the correct balance of meaning, we'll probably talk about that more because it's so important. But at any rate, Baba then would have Irish go through the laborious process of reciting out the alphabet, A, C, D, E, F, and he would stop them at the particular letter and then do the same thing for the next letter. And by this manner, in a really key important word, Baba would have the entire word spelled out in this laborious manner. So, what all of this simply says in so many words is nothing got by Baba in all of the material that he dictated, which goes up to the final long longish chapter, which is Erish's summation of the material. And then I think the famous chapter 10, which is a paragraph or two, which we'll probably save over till tomorrow to discuss, because I think there's a key point involved there also. So, at any rate, all of the material up to the supplement, except for Erish's tail end contribution, was gone over by Bob in that laborious manner. All right, so you say, all right, Stevens, you put in so much time reassuring us about how Bob did, but what under the sun did you and Mercy deduce when you got hold of the manuscript? Did you massacre it? Well, I hope you didn't massacre it. Particularly in view of the fact that Bob says I put an atomic spiritual bomb on each word. So if we discard 2 words, inadvertently, we've lost an awful lot of psychic energy for the future. So, at any rate, when we got it, we came over with Blood Dimple from Baba. Mercy Deduce was living on the East Coast in New York. I was living in San Francisco. But somewhere or another, many of you would say, Baba arranged for you to take a trip. And so, at any rate, I got to New York City, and Mercy Deduce had the manuscript. She explained to me, Mercy Deduce had the manuscript. She explained to me that the supplement, or one part of it, one big chunk of it, was material which Ghani had written down, which Baba had given him, and which, after he died, Baba said, oh, this is interesting stuff, but this isn't what Baba really thought Ghani was writing down. That's why Baba started it all over again, you see. So Ghani was not tossed into the ash can, but he was laid aside, you see. But Baba kept the manuscript and sent it along. He said to Mercy Deduce, now look, you can do any of 3 things. You can keep it all and put it all in God Speaks if you want, in a separate part, of course. Or you can keep some parts of it, or you can keep none of it and just throw it all out and use none of it. That's left to you as a decision. And as one of you pointed out, I think a little bit earlier when we were sitting here, that in the supplement there is an amazing use of a lot of Sufi terminology and concepts, because Ghani was a real scholar in Sufism, Muslim background. So Ghani had put down all this material, Myrtle being the head of the Sufi order that Baba had by now reoriented. She decided that this was really awfully good material for the Sufis, and she wanted to save almost all of it. So I thought it was very, very, very sweet of her, the manner in which she handled it. She said something like this, but you can see what she was aiming at. She said, now, Don, of course, I'm the Sufi Murshid, and Ghani's got all this material, and of course it's not quite as straightforward and direct as what he dictated to Erish, so I'll keep the Sufi material and work on it, and you take the material he gave to Erish, because I had to go off on my field trips around the East Coast and so on. She kept the Ghani material. She at once said, I have 1 or 2 thoughts in my mind that I think should guide us. And I've always blessed her for this, because I felt that she took a decision of enormous importance on this, spiritual birthright that Baba gave to us. She said, first of all, I don't think that we should cut out any words, but above all, any sentences. Simplified sentences, yes. And secondly, I would suggest that, except in the rarest of occasions, that we change a word. Now that was fairly simple as far as I was concerned, because as you all know, Erish has extremely good command of the English language. He knows how to use them. He's used them so long, and he's such a bright person. And he's been in this position for Baba, translating Baba's thoughts and gestures into readable English for the people who sit around for donkey's years now. So he's really an expert at it. So almost, there would be only maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times in the whole manuscript that I don't know. Here, Erish definitely made a mistake, and I would put that with it. So I would say the thing, though, that was really tough, there would be sentences, because Erish's mind, it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. and there's almost never a comma or a break, never a period, you know. So you'd have a paragraph that'd be a whole page with one sentence in there. Well, my mind just sort of gets boggled and tired out, you know. I would just sort of hold my face and my God, what do I do with this? So I would break it down, but I would break it down in a fashion so that in a very clever manner I didn't lose any words, nor stick Stephen's words in there. So I would say that 97 to 99% of God's speech up to the supplement is exactly as Baba gave, but with a bit of liberty of sentence structure put into it. And Myrtle was also very meticulous about the same thing, even in the Gandhi manuscript. Let's give Lois the first choice here. Steve, you're next on the hit list.
Yeah, I don't know if this may be minor or not, but it did bother me, so I did want to ask about it. In reading aloud, we were reading from two different editions of God Speaks, and I was reading from an older edition that I bought in 1970.
Yeah.
And there, some of the wording is different. It's now like politically correct for one thing instead of the he and this and that. And I guess my question about, and I don't think it's changed enough that it shifts the meaning of anything. It didn't appear to, but my question was about it was I know that the edition that I was reading, that's the one where Baba had approved every word or whatever he was saying. How did you word that?
There's a little story on that one too.
Okay, so anyway, I just wondered why, if Baba had okayed what you had edited on that version, why there was the need to change the wording in the next edition to where it was more politically correct. I wondered why it couldn't just be trusted that this is God Speaks and this is the way he wrote it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could
make a comment on it. Well, two quick things on that, Lois. First of all, it is certainly true that gradually there accumulated some specific suggestions. I can't remember how much we changed the he's to he or she or whatever not. I suppose we probably did. But the thing that was most important was that there was the opportunity to bring up various points at more length when we were doing. Let's go back to the first edition, first of all, because I want you to understand one important addition that was made spontaneously at the time of editing. Every once in a while, Myrtle, every once in a while, Don would run into a section where either it was beyond us or it was a little bit confused in the wording. We couldn't be sure of meaning. So we'd fire off a letter independently. I wouldn't go through Myrtle and she wouldn't go through me off to India. And Baba would immediately reply to those letters. And sometimes his reply was a paragraph, sometimes it was 2-3 pages that he would give. And we always found that what came back from Baba was so tremendously interesting and clarifying that we just said, God, this has got to go into the original edition. Sometimes, if it was in the part I was handling, dictated through Arish, I'd put it in as a footnote. Sometimes we would say, no, this can't go into that part, but it could fit back into the supplement. But in that case, where we put it in, we would say almost always, there were 1 or 2 slip-ups, but almost always, it's in quotes, and Baba said, and Baba clarified something of that sort. But this is direct from Baba himself. So that's an important addition, first of all, Lois. The second thing was that, as far as I was concerned, of course, I was bombarded with why the devil didn't you simplify these things when Baba repeats himself for the 5th or the 6th time. People felt that an editor ought to be sharp enough to eliminate
Correct God.
Yeah, correct God, yeah. Let's get good editing and let God take care of himself. He's big enough to do that. So there we were. You know, it kept coming in and in and in. What about all this repetition stuff? And I got sort of fed up. I thought I'd covered it when I brought in this beautiful example of a Bach fugue. You know, you start out with a simple melody and then you make the melody a little more complicated, and you add another voice, and you get an interweaving, and it's fantastic. I didn't quite believe when I was still puzzled, but I wanted to be as positive as possible, and I thought it was quite an excellent job. So I didn't have much patience for the repetitiveness. But you know, the amazing thing is the second biggest objection was the use of capital letters. And I must admit I'd already cut out about half of the capital letters. Because you know, everything that pertains to divinity, even if it's around the block, gets capitalized in India. It was pretty carefully and checked with God himself over a period of time. We didn't change our signals with Baba on that score. But that doesn't completely answer your sense of a bit of disquiet, and I think it's legitimate. Why should I try to pretend differently? In other words, you tamper with God with great care. And this is a good time to bring up something else about tampering with God. Yes, we would go back and discuss the point, and probably advertently or inadvertently exercise some pressure on Baba. And one of the things that, especially in the latter part of Baba's life in this body, it began to strike me because I got to be around him so many times in just quiet, intimate situations where only one or two people would be around him, or somebody had come in, had the privilege of coming in to see Baba for 10, 15 minutes because they had some urgent things they wanted to check with him. And again and again. Of course, the urgent thing was the person had a problem. Deep in a family feud, or finances were going bad, or son Johnny, or whatever his name was, didn't want to go to the right school and take the right courses. You know, these things would come up. The latter part of his life, Baba would very rarely tend to give personal decisions and advice. It's amazing. It was very rare. So, all right, every once in a while, we know the person will do this, try that, have you thought about so-and-so? And it was amazing how often, a day or two later, or maybe I see the person a year or two later coming back and say, well, Baba, yes, that was very good advice you gave me, but you didn't understand the whole situation. Isn't that absolutely incredible? But you know, I mean, too, the thing that just had me goggle-eyed, I'm sure I did it too. I didn't register when I would do it. But one or two of the people who Baba trusted and relied upon and gave great big jobs to, they were some of the worst offenders. I had to be the messenger boy some of the time, so I know intimately about what went on. Baba just didn't understand that. If he had understood what she was doing and what she's opposed to over there, and you know, all of this, and Don, carry this back to Baba so he gets the real understanding of this. Even if I disagree, you know, I've got to be a good soldier and do what I'm told to do. But I carry this back. Baba would understand I had no bone to pick in all of this. And then Baba would take this about two arguments in length. And what would he do when the person says he still doesn't understand it? And that time he would say, tell her to do so-and-so, which is what they wanted to do, of course. Then they would say, Baba told me to do so-and-so, of course. And they would have forgotten how long it took them to argue Baba into a position where he'd throw in the sponge and just say, okay, go ahead and do it. And you know why? Because, and I think this is terribly important, and we're certainly going to go into this deep hook, line, and sinker tomorrow. And that is, you know, the subject Baba brought out in his last message on the album, interlinks. And this, I think, is one of the most meaningful, important concepts that Baba has given us, the importance of interlinks. But I'm not going to steal too much thunder from this. To me, Baba's internal relationship to us, that inner linkage, is so important that if he saw that I was so opinionated and so tough and stubborn about some of my ingrained prejudices and desires, Baba would not run the risk of doing any damage to that inner link. He would give, even though he knew it was not the right thing for me, and I'd have to go back later on or maybe even in another lifetime, and go back over the same darn thing. But when, let's say, the situation is a bit more propitious. But to me, it was obvious that when he gave in, it was because he was preserving at all costs that inner link of absolute love and confidence. A hand went up somewhere or another. Oh, yes.
Going back to the point that you had made that God speaks is after you and Myrtle had completed the editing, that it's 97%.
That's a rough Stephen statistic,
Okay.
but I think it's pretty close to it, Steve.
Regarding the 3% then, I'd like to clarify one thing. Is that 3% made up of completely just the insertion of periods and changing pronouns?
For me it was. Not even changing pronouns. Capitals and commas and periods. That was the bulk of what I typed simply and
Just
frankly.
punctuation only.
Yeah. It was a pretty innocuous 3%. wasn't it? I'm proud of that. Yes.
Can I clarify one point? I've always misunderstood this, I think. Are you saying the entire second edition was edited, redone prior to Bob's dropping the body? Did you? Okay.
I, as a matter of fact, not long after the first edition came out, got a copy and started in noting things that I hadn't noted at first, and also suggesting to myself where maybe we could chop out some more capitals. And then as various different comments and this discussion back and forth through Monty, principally with Bob, accumulated over the years. That was the Bible for the second edition. I kept accumulating the material in it. But that was carefully worked out with India. Almost always Baba participated. Yes?
Okay, I haven't seen the latest edition, but I'm talking about the 74 edition, where like the noun and its pronouns keep being repeated over and over again, where normally there would be, the noun and its adjectives, a pronoun. And when I read it, in order to keep my attention on it, I have to automatically substitute a pronoun so I can understand what it's saying. And I wonder if maybe Baba, when he's using an alphabet board, he used dittos a lot, and instead of putting the whole thing in over and over again, maybe what Bob wanted to use, instead of saying the whatever it is, mental body or soul, whatever it is, you could just say it, or something like that.
It's a good point. I certainly noted that. And I'll just be honest with you, I decided to leave it in exactly that way. And I can't point to any logic. Sometimes in your life you try to back yourself up with a logic. But in that case, I just can't. I just decided it would be wrong if I substituted a pronoun for it because it was a repetition of what was said a line before, a term.
Baba wouldn't actually use the words again, he would just point to that, do it again, maybe.
But this was read out to Baba the next morning. This was read out to Baba. So the repetition of something that could easily have been substituted by a pronoun obviously was his Baba wanted. It bothered me as it did you. And then I said, no, this gets into that danger, never now, that we decided we wouldn't get into. And I was all happy afterwards that I resisted it, left it that way. I don't know if I think it's right that way. Maybe there's some pretty big spiritual bombs on the world. Put a big enough one on a pronoun. Anyway, that's pretty good logic that I'm going to.
That's good.
And I think there was one other hand before we go
I
on.
was just going to say that I think that it has to do with our own impatience and our own intolerance for certain concentrated material.
I'm going to stop you right there because you're putting your finger on, I think, one of the most key, important problems that we have to face practically in reading God Speaks. And the reason that it's a big problem and something important for us to face is because just about everybody sitting in this room is going to last long enough in this body to be a key to unlock God Speaks to some other people. I think we're sitting here today because Baba has decided to take the wraps off of God Speaks after several decades where it has been largely undercovered. We've got to find out the reasons for the resistance and what was Baba up to and what is our responsibility. So I think very, very definitely what it comes down to is that this is the next subject we're going to start taking up right now. We have inbred into us unconsciously a whole childhood and adolescence of schooling and what constitutes a proper creative writing. And one of the first rules in the thing is, for God's sake, don't repeat yourself. And so, first thing, come into a God speech, God, the avatars repeat. Oh, no, let's not think about that, you know. You resist the idea of potentially criticizing beloved Baba. But nevertheless, you've got a conflict, and many people just get tired out of the conflict and they put it aside. So, you know, it's a two-way street here. It's not just a book sitting out here, but I, myself, have a real... we got Adele on the line here. Adele, oh, no? Oh, yes, what would you like to say?
When I was teaching ESL at grade school,
You may have to speak a little louder because I'm not sure they can hear you there.
when I was teaching ESL at grammar school, we would have periodic seminars and give some instruction on how to deal with certain things involved. And with the foreign children, children that had just come from another country, I have, he has, she has, they, all those are very difficult for them to get. And at one point, there were some statistics, and I cannot give you the source, but it was communicated to us. It takes 49 repetitions before it actually sinks into the consciousness of these children. So repeat. I just thought that was a little apropos.
Yeah, for the original learning. But then we have been taught repetitively, maybe not 49 times, but we have learned quite young in life what is considered to be proper rules for creative writing. And without realizing it, this is automatically what we apply. So if Baba decided for some reason that he's going to disobey 2 or 3 or 4 of these ingrained patterns, you know, without realizing it, something down in the unconscious rises up in rebellion. And what this is simply saying very, very importantly is, without realizing it, we're part of a two-way street here. Here's God's speech coming towards us, and our imposition of a pattern, a way of going about it, appreciating it or not appreciating, criticizing, is our unconscious contribution. I bring this up because this is something that science has certainly had to come to grips with in the last 50 to 100 years, that there is no such thing as something observed and unaffected by the observer. You know, this, I'll bore you if you can hold still for 5 or 10 minutes with, I think, 3 of the most stunning examples of this in science, and they're not hard to understand. There was a fellow by the name of Heisenberg who began thinking and observing this sort of thing, and he came up with something we call the uncertainty principle. And it was simply that, especially as you get to smaller and smaller particles, there's no way that you can observe and define what and where and how that particle is without influencing it. So as soon as you've observed it, it ain't what you observed, it's something else. And so the observer is terribly important. Another beautiful example of this, I think this is what was very well described by Timothy Ferris. He points out that what the observer has got in mind, the way he shapes the question, affects the response he gets. You say, oh, that sounds absolutely crazy. But if you look into scientific literature, a simple thing as asking an electron, or whether it's a wave, in other words, an energy motion, or whether it's a particle, ping, it can hit you, you know. Which is it? Is it a wave or is it a particle? when you set up your first experiment, you ask the first question, are you awake? Well, the electron replies, of course I'm awake, I'm awake. So you say, well, that's very interesting. And then you call up your next door cohort who's in the laboratory down the line and say, I got the answer back, it's awake. And then you go home, and because scientists, are sort of skeptical and they try to be absolutely honest, he says, maybe I'd better repeat that experiment just for the ducks of it. I'm going to ask if he's a particle this time. So the scientist, thinking he's a little bit stupid even to do that, when he got a good, clear answer on the first go around, he goes back to his lab and he says this time, are you a particle? What's the electron do? It says, of course I'm a particle. Hey, there we are. You see? So, I'm not bright enough to set up these experiments and know why they should come out that way, but this is the amazing fact. The question that you ask in especially subatomic physics begins to be of this sort. What you ask, the darn thing affects it. And the third one that I think is absolutely priceless, this has me still on the ropes. That gets to the business of, okay, you've got a laser beam that you set up. And a little way down the pathway, you put up a barrier that reflects part of it off here, and the other half of it just goes dead straight ahead. And the one that you've diverted off over here, you let it go quite some distance, and then you fiddle with it. And so what ends up, this diverted part, when it finally ends up where you want it to be, and you look at it, it says, I've been fiddled with. Okay. Now, let's not get moral about this, we're in a different field here. But the extraordinary thing is, when the guy's friend who was observing the part of the laser beam that wasn't fiddled with, and he measures, the crazy thing says, I've been fiddled with. And it's so far from the part that was fiddled with and the part that you didn't do anything, that there is not even time at the speed of light to get the message from the fiddled part over to the unfiddled part. So locality has no meaning in this particular thing. Now, doesn't that sound suspiciously like Mayor Baba? Yeah. That a perfect one is independent of time and space. I think these bridges you're getting awfully close together, aren't they? Anyway, I think it gets to be pretty exciting. Where do all that have to do? Well, what we're simply saying is that certainly scientists have had to come to grips with the fact that the observer plays a key, important, modifying role. What I want to leave with you is, at this point, we have a key modifying role to Baba's words. We can't get away from it. I hope sometime, either this morning or this afternoon, I'll give you 2 examples of what I did. I've always sort of thought, let's do it now, because we're right in the middle of this business of fiddling inadvertently. And that's what goes on. That's what is so terribly important with Baba's words. Our contribution, without realizing how we modify it. I had a very, very inspiring and exciting discourse study group in London shortly after I was transferred over there in the late 60s. And one of the fellows in the group eventually had to leave London, and he went up country, and about maybe 3 years later we had a good chance for an old home reunion session together, have lunch and catch up. And we were walking out of the restaurant and walking up the street. Everything was great, and how much he missed the old discourse group and so on. And then he sort of slowed in his walking. This is Mike DaCosta, and Mike won't mind my mentioning his name, because boy, I'm so grateful to Mike DaCosta that I have to give him credit for what he did for me. Mike sort of slowed his gait going up the street, and he sort of looks around this way at me, and I said, I've never seen Mike DaCosta look at me that way. There must be something going to come up here. And so I sharpened my attention. He said, Don, I have a little bone to pick with you. Well, I don't mind people picking bones with me, but I was really curious as to what Mike had dragged out. So he says, you remember those discourses on occultism? I said, yes, oh, absolutely, quite a few of them. We spent quite a bit of time. Now, in those days, in the discourse study group, I thought I was, pretty much of a spiritual hotshot. I thought I'd been through these under Baba's guidance and tutelage, doing the re-editing, and that if anybody ought to be able to offer something, I probably could. This is all subconscious, but that's the way I felt about it, obviously. So what I would do, because we didn't have time in the group meeting, the maximum hour and a half, to go through word by word, I'd put little carrots of the things that we had to be sure to read out directly of Baba's words. And I had those 3 little volumes of discourses. I always kept them. And he said, well, Don, I have to tell you one thing that surprised me. I recently had to go back through and reread the discourses on occultism. And he said, can you believe it? I was a little surprised, he said. You quoted all of the negative things that Baba said about occultism, and you left out all of the positive things that Baba said about occultism. But nobody had ever said anything like that to me before in my life. It was tantamount to doubting all of my Swedish honesty. Sufi honesty and Baba honesty. Laying it down the line, this was a big priority he had covered. And that little fell swoop. I just couldn't believe it. I wasn't mad. I was incredulous. It couldn't happen. It just couldn't happen under the circumstances. So I said, well, Mike, maybe I can check that, but what you say really startles me, so I'm going to think about it. I went home, put my hands on my 3 little blue books, went to occultism, and you know what? He was absolutely dead right. I hadn't included one positive. Now, Baba spends a fair time cautioning you about don't get picked on occult experiences, but he also says that a perfect one, avatar, a perfect master, will on occasion use an occult experience to reinforce the individual, or when he's going to go into a tough situation. Give him stamina, or give him courage when he's beating himself up all of the time, So Baba says this is used, but be careful, because it's so intoxicating that you're likely to get in a habit of just wanting repetition and repetition and repetition and repetition, in which case it's nothing but an ego trip finally for you. Well, then I really had to think back. Why did I do that? How could I possibly have done it? And then I remembered probably the thing related to the occult world that had affected me more than any other. I'll tell you just a little bit of what family affairs, but there's nothing particularly secret about it. Back in the days when Myrtle de Martin was still alive and the head of the Sufi order, and Myrtle de Deus was not yet in the saddle, Myrtle de Martin had contracted cancer. Before she had contracted the cancer of the lymph gland, she had spent 2 years studying with Elizabeth Patterson and with Marina Machiavelli in New York, and had decided that Baba was the successor for her to Inayat Khan as her master, and that he should be the new spiritual head of the Sufi order wherever she had jurisdiction, which was a brave decision to take. Shortly after that, as she contracted the cancer and gradually declined. I go way, way back in history to give you a little tiny thing that had happened, great thing that had happened. When Inayat Khan was going to make a trip back to India, which turned out to be his last trip to India, he said to Myrtle de Martin, now while I'm away, if you need to be in touch in any way, just give a message to so-and-so who was a Sufi who was rather psychic and, quite deeply, profoundly developed in the psychic area. And said, through him we'll be able to communicate if it's an urgent matter. So, Myrtle de Martin, being a loving, trusting individual, deeply devoted to Inayat Khan, simply took this as God's gospel. She didn't have to get in touch with Inayat Khan because shortly after he contracted the pneumonia in India and died. But this had always stayed in her mind that if it was important for an icon to get in touch, trust so-and-so who have the psychic capacity to be in touch with an icon. So after Myrtle de Martin had put the Sufi order under the jurisdiction of Mayor Vala, contracted the cancer, was really declining rather rapidly, she had almost a last-minute impulse to sign over the Sufi property, not a great deal of it, but that also. In other words, that everything that she had any rights to should be passed on to Mayor Vala. And so she made out a document of that sort. And the psychic individual loved the property. He raised hell. He said, and Nayat Khan was furious about it. And just absolutely crucified Myrtle de Martin. Well, you can be sure that when I heard about it, I heard it as a psychologist and not as a spiritual student. I said, this guy is simply doing what he wants selfishly, egotistically to do. He wants the property back if there's any way to do it. It didn't. But this absolutely put poor Myrtle de Martin in her final days into really a position of absolute agony. What did that do? I recount such a personal thing because I think it's important to understand how we can be so colored. This sort of an experience, it was the one negative experience. I have a number of friends who are quite psychic and who handle it beautifully in a controlled fashion. But in this fashion, it had been so badly misused that it colored subconsciously my entire outlook on the field. And I put the carrots around the part that I thought, would correspond to what I wish Myrtle de Martin could have avoided, and none around the positive parts. Isn't it interesting? It was dear old Mike DaCosta who set me into a pattern of investigation and trying to be honest with myself. It showed me how even when you are priding yourself on being honest, an authoritative person in the field, you can kid yourself. And really colored the material. And this was direct from Vala. So that was one that taught me a great deal. The other one, I'll do that one a little bit more briefly, I hope. She listed down. Oh yes, we've got a little bit of time. The other one taught me equally, but a little bit more easily, a very important thing. I think from the first time that I ever heard the word samskara, you heard it? I had sort of an automatic negative reaction because as soon as I heard the word, I found out these are the ogres which block our realization of truth, which is God and our own God. And I was impressed by the fact that Mayor Baba says that the level of consciousness in the last animal stage is developed to the level of where consciousness can reflect and eventually, under the proper circumstances, realize itself as God. So consciousness does not develop any further than that, but it is blocked by the samskaras. So, and then Mayor Baba points out to us, what is it, 180,000, 3 million, I don't know how many. Statistics always bore me, but he gives us a horrific figure of how many reincarnations you've got to go through before you even begin to loosen these samskaric knots a little bit. And so I was thinking, gosh, the real job has been done, the developing of God's consciousness. And we got to spend all of that time and an awful lot of it in agony and misery and upset in order to get rid of these lousy old samskaras. So you see, samskaras just automatically have a bad reputation in my subconscious. Then we go ahead, and first thing you know, I've been telling people, authoritatively of course, that samskaras are the byproduct of the coming to consciousness that we've got to get rid of. Like, I remember using this analogy. You know, when you build a building, you saw off this and you cut off that, and there are the old pieces of pipe and plaster sitting around. And before you can put in the garden and make it a beautiful place to live in, you got to get rid of the byproduct. Now, this to me was the samskaras, you see. And I was thinking, okay, get out the cleanup crew. It's going to take a long time, but eventually you've got them cleaned up. I assigned absolutely no positive role to samskaras. They were simply negative. So along comes another absolutely wonderful guy, and not quite from the first discourse group, but the second discourse group, starting on the second generation. His name's Bruce Milburn. Maybe some of you run into the Milburn family, bigger and beyond. Bruce went through all of them, and some of you probably know a fellow by the name of Jack Anderson, is it, or Dick Anderson? Dick Anderson was a Sufi and quite an interesting person in many, many ways, and an avid reading ability and realizing what he was reading. And he came over to London and met several other people around who loved Baba. And incidentally, pointed out that there was some very interesting material in a little Neshbook edited edition called Sparks. And these are really later discourse type material given out by Baba, which didn't go into the original discourses. They're a later vintage. And in a couple of those, Baba very definitely is talking about saving the positive value in the samskaras. Sort of like a little nugget of gold. He talks about getting rid of the compulsion part and saving the value part of it. So Bruce called me up on the phone with great excitement and said, Don, you've got to get hold of a copy of Spark because there's some good material about samskaras. And he went on to say that it's positive. There's real value in the samskaras. I remember saying very bluntly to Bruce over the phone, Bruce, this is the first time in my life that I've ever heard anything about there being anything positive in samskaras. It just completely upset me. And so I conveniently set down the phone. I didn't have a copy of Sparks, and I managed to get this one back in the steel closet, where you didn't have to get it out. And so about 2-3 weeks later, Bruce said, well, did you get the Sparks? And I said, well, no, I didn't have time. That was baloney, but anyway, well, Bruce said, I've got 2 copies and you take a copy. And so I dutifully took a copy home with me. I'm going to be honest, to that point, I knew that Bruce had misinterpreted it, but nevertheless, I should read it through. So I read it through, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It wasn't quite as clear as I thought Bruce made it over the phone, but it seemed to go in the direction that there was some value in these samskaras that had to be saved out. So I put it aside, and it wasn't until about 5 years later, just about 2 years ago, I had to go to a clinic, and when you get old like me, the prostate acts up, and you got to have things done to it. And so it took 9 days in the hospital, and I knew Baba was going to use this to good advantage somewhere or another. And by God, in that period of time, he really cracked my concept of samskara. And what he opened up has been one of the most extraordinary, what should I say, experiences of feeling into things I've never dreamed. The Father has it all clear there, but I had blocked it off. Now, so all of this is just simply preparatory, and I know it's taken a long time, but I feel that one of the most important things that we have got to do in God's speech, and especially, I feel we all have a responsibility to Baba. Remember, he says, I can do it all myself, but where it can help you in your ongoing, I'm going to entrust certain parts of my divine universal work to you. And this is where I'm convinced Baba is not only taking off the wraps, but he is giving us a chance to take off the wraps in such a manner that we can be positively helpful to make the process less agonizing, time-consuming, excruciating. God advises repeating it again and all of that sort of business, and help to open up the door a little bit more rapidly and carefully to other people. If Bob is taking the wraps off of God's speech, this is his time to get over that. I spent so much of your time and interest and concentration this morning to outline we, without realizing it, on a two-way street, have our own set of barriers, unconsciously, of which we erect, and our own interpretations. And it's high time that we be honest with ourselves and take a careful look and say, maybe that could happen to me. I wouldn't have dreamed that Stevens could be that stupid, but maybe I'm maybe halfway as stupid as he has been. Now, I'd like to start us off, and we've got just a little bit of time to start off getting into now the meat of God speaks itself. We've been setting the stage here, and I think it's a terribly important stage. Now, I would like to take us right back to the beginning of God speaks, and of course, the beginning of God speaks is God in the beyond state. Anybody like to volunteer? We did this last time I was here, and it only took us a half an hour to do this, but I hope we can do it in 5 minutes. What are the key important characteristics of God in the beyond state? And we'll start going, Steve.
Divine sleep state.
Oh boy. Well, Steve, that isn't one of the 3 key characteristics that Baba gives us, though.
Okay.
Unconscious.
Formless.
Unconscious.
Formless. Yeah, infinite.
You said unconscious. Okay. That is certainly one of the 3 that Baba lists, and that's the one that really threw me for a loop. Because I'd always been brought up as a Christian, you know, and God is all wise with a long white beard, and on my tradition, benevolent and loving. But certainly conscious. So unconscious really threw me up. You had another one.
Infinite.
Infinite. Okay. Mm-hmm. We got the 3rd one. Where's the 3rd one?
Indivisible.
Indivisible. Those are the 3. I'm glad somebody's got their notes with them, you know. There we are. Okay. Infinite, indivisible, unconscious. And does anybody remember that other key word, that there is also something called the latency available? What is the latency? Anybody take a crack at that?
Unknown. Creation. Latency of creation.
Unknown. Unknown. No, it's not that Baba says is the key part of the latency.
The creation.
Right back there.
The urge to know itself.
The which itself?
The urge to know himself.
The urge to know himself. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And there's one key word that you still don't have. The urge to know himself or his divinity is the way.
Well, yeah.
But then what is the final word Baba crosses in? Do you remember it? Consciously.
Right.
To know his divinity consciously. In other words, some way, the whim has the magic touch to transmute the unconscious into consciousness of his own divinity. And then I suggest in the work notes, maybe you got the work notes there as well as the agenda as well as the notes. I suggest that inevitably, because toward time I'm going to jump to something terribly important and come back because it's so important to pick that up mostly tomorrow. Individuality. I have to put that word, individualized consciousness, because it is Baba himself. I was really shocked. I don't know how many, really, dozens or even hundreds of times I've gone through God speech for the various things I've had to do. And that word, individualized, had not hit me until we were working on the French translation. And all of a sudden I saw 3 words linked together. Infinite, individualized consciousness. And I'd always read infinite consciousness. And for some reason or another, my mind had just skipped over the word individualized. And when I saw it, I said, God, that's where you and I come into it. That's where we come into the scheme. And this has certainly got a lot more meaning and importance than I'd ever realized. So, then, because by that time we had all of God Speaks on the computer for the French version, I just put in the couple of variants in French, and I found Baba, in the latter part of what he dictated to Erich, uses these 3 words together 4 times. Isn't that absolutely dumbfounding? I was astonished and delighted and amazed. There we are. because it's so important. So, at any rate, I just have to, when we start talking about the latency, in addition to the whim to know his divinity consciously, I have to add the word, as part of the latency, that it's individualized consciousness that is latent. Because Baba himself uses that combination 4 times. I don't think we have to ask Baba always, even right at the start, to use everything that is significant. So we can't criticize him for this, I think. But we'll get along to that. Okay, all right. Then we also went over this last time I was here. Does anybody remember Baba's beautiful analogy of the start of the surgeon of the whim? He gives us a little story to make it sort of easy and visualizable to us. Do you remember his story?
The ocean.
The ocean.
The ocean.
Well, he talks a great deal about the ocean and the drop, but you know, that the ocean and the drop doesn't have too much to do with the whim.
The mischievous chicken.
No, the mischievous chicken comes way on long after. That's Bao's special. That's way after the whim comes along. So it's not even time to get Bao specially into it yet. What happens? Just how does he describe to us a little story that's like
Was
the
it
surgeon
stirring in the ocean?
No, the ocean's not here. Don't get stuck with the ocean. I just have to warn you, that's up the wrong sea. Well, that's because we've taken a lot of time with Stevens's meanderings about the unconscious and the role it plays in God's speech. Absolutely. Steve, come along now.
Pebble
Yeah.
in the pond and the ripples.
Yeah, and it was the little boy walking along beside. I always think of them as a 9-year-old because they're pretty intelligent and still given to whims at that point. They still do things very spontaneously. So Baba says, just think of it like a little boy who's walking along the side of a huge, flat, rippleless, calm lake. And he sees a stone. And for no reason, he has the whim to throw the stone into the pond. And so then, what good does that do for us? What comes out of that? You remember? In January, we traced this through, but it took a little bit of doing. Anybody remember what that does that links us up to creation? Even Adele's forgotten. What would you like to put in? It gives waves. Well, let's not get into infinite combinations. That's jumping a little too far into the story. Let's just take a wave.
Opposition. Opposition.
She says opposition. All right. I would like to change that a little bit from opposition, which is pretty extreme, to contrast, which is the beginning. Contrast. That's one thing. And does anybody have an idea as to how contrast may fit into the important aspects of creation as we know it?
So this is a duality.
It's just the beginning, the most simple form of duality. But how does duality do something for us? Come on, Peter, you're right chugging down the track. Do you remember how duality does something which is critically important?
The cause and effect for the...
No, not cause and effect. Cause and effect is going to be involved in creation, that's absolutely certain. Let's just stop the camera where we have contrast and duality.
Gives you a reference?
Does this have anything at all to... What were you saying?
Gives you a reference?
Beginning of consciousness.
To say what is and what isn't, or to contrast?
That is part of contrast, but it's not... We're not bridging over to one of the terribly important aspects of what creation is doing about God's whim to know His consciousness. What would you add to that?
First beginning of awareness.
All right. How does it do it? You're carrying on where Peter left off. The beginning of awareness. But I would not say awareness because then we'll get hung up in definitions. But I'd like to say that it's the beginning. Contrast is the beginning of the possibility of consciousness. And then I have to remind you of one thing that I simply laid out on the table when we were together in January. I said, this is the way I always have to look at it. It goes back to Carl Jung. Carl Jung said, he was writing about consciousness in one of his books, that it's like having a battery with two poles. They're opposite poles, you see, contrast, positive, negative, with a little filament of metal between them. And what flows between those two opposite poles is comparable to consciousness. It is the electricity which is generated. And I've always thought that was one of the most beautiful descriptions of when one becomes conscious. One becomes conscious of something in a situation where there is contrast or opposition. It certainly is related to duality, contrast. So we've got where consciousness comes in, but do we have anything else? Where does matter get into all this? Well, this universe has got a lot of matter. Can we get matter tied into it?
I would say that out of the own point comes the most gross, which is the opposite of infinity.
Well, Baba says out of the own point come these things, but how do they tie in? How does, let's say, a wave, because the surging of the whim, the only way we can visualize it is a wave of disturbance. So we've got, in the wave, we've got contrast, and we get consciousness out of contrast. But how can we get matter, for instance, out of that wave? Can somebody do a try on that? What would you
First
like?
Sanskara is created?
I didn't understand.
The first Sanskara.
Well, he's going to come out of it too, but I'd like to take him up as number 3 if we could, and see if we can first get over to something or another that seems to imply matter, materiality.
Is it part of the dream, like his original?
Well, Baba says the whole blessed thing is the long run is a dream. It is the zero part of infinity from which all of creation comes out. Well, let's just be simple with each other. What is matter? Good Albert Einstein gave us the equation which equates matter with energy. So what is a wave but energy? So isn't that is when the first iota of matter comes into existence, the disturbance. It is also the most simple form of matter. And then, of course, if the kid keeps tossing in more stones and the wave gets more complicated, we have the possibility for more complex forms of matter, the succeeding disturbances. So we've got consciousness, and we've got matter, and the third thing that you wanted to tie into it simply is the first impression. And you know, I think that the only way, I've never been able to crack it any other way than just to say, well, obviously, all of this disturbance is occurring in infinite God. But infinite God has to be infinitely sensitive, doesn't he? To be impressed by anything that happens within his infinite being. So, he is aware of the fact of something has happened, and that is an impression. So the wave also creates, registers. Baba says it's a lot of psychic energy. We're back to energy again. But it is registered in some sort of an accounting or a memory pattern in infinite God. So Baba says that as soon as this impulse, the whim of God to know his divinity consciousness surges, it is such a tremendous shock in the infinite, indivisible quietness of God that it produces the first iota of consciousness. We trace that through. The first iota of form matter, we trace that through. And I just said arbitrarily, I think we just have to assume that God is infinitely impressionable, and so he stores up the record of a shock having occurred, and that's the impression. But the terribly important thing about this impression is that it has a very strange property. A lot of people there I know deal with computers, and the jargon gets around. So a lot of people are used to the word coding, that something is coded. I just sort of have to think of that knot of psychic energy as also being coded in a very strange manner, in a very strange fashion. This is horribly important to creation, and that is that it has to express itself or be discharged in a comparable situation to that in which it was formed. It is coded to the environment. My God, that is, if we've struck something there that is true, this is terribly important. But this is exactly what a habit is, isn't it? It wants to do the same thing that it did when it was formed. But I don't know any other accumulation of energy which is similarly coded. And boy, this is a real puzzle. Sometime we better get Timothy Ferris to start thinking about this one. Yes, Adele.
At what point in that expression of the energy is the whim expressed? Who am I?
Well,
when is that expressed?
That is basic to the whole whim, and we just have to assume that God's latency knows the extensive, complex path that it has to follow before the answer to who am I can be answered. And it can't be answered until consciousness is developed to a point when, clarified and unclouded, it can reflect and see itself. I am infinite God. You know, I think we better stop for lunch there.
Excuse me. So he knows of the form before?
Form, the first iota of form, is one of three things that happens instantly on the searching of the whim. First iota of consciousness, first iota of form, and the first iota of impression, which wants to repeat it. You answer.
Isn't it simultaneously? You have God and full consciousness power?
Simultaneously, your very low voice, and I can almost not understand you, and I'm sure over there they can't hear you.
Yeah. Isn't it at the same time the initial urge or initial whim happened? You not only have the first iota of the most gross form, but you also have the answer of God in the beyond state, of completeness and everything?
All right. It is absolutely true because there is no such thing as time and space to perfection, which God is. So the end of the story is that instantly God has infinite consciousness of His divinity. And we are living through how that was all formed in the illusion of time and space. That's the end of the story. So we'll probably get there as we trudge along sometime tomorrow afternoon. But we're just at the beginning within illusion and this tremendously complex formation that goes through in the dream or the city or itself. Yes, one, and then I think we have to call a halt for lunch.
I had to say this because I've always had the most difficult time. It's probably because of growing up in a Western society, but the idea of a whim is very hard for me to accept because I keep thinking of cause and effect. Mm-hmm. And this to explain the whim, it's hard for my mind to accept. Yeah. I keep thinking there has to be a cause to that whim.
Well, can I give you Baba's direct words on that? Because many people ask him that. I said, Baba, I have a heck of a time trying to visualize the whim and how it happened. Baba simply said, as far as the nature of the whim and the logic of its surging, this is absolutely impossible for you to seize in human form. And you must wait for clarification of this until you are realized as God. And then you will understand.
There you go.
Is there a great way to get through that one?